The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, a small town where the desert met civilization in an uneasy truce. I walked down Main Street, my long black hair catching the afternoon light, feeling the familiar weight of being different in a place that prided itself on sameness. My name is Iona Crow Feather, and I'm 24 years old. My grandmother always said I had the desert in my blood and the wind in my spirit. What she didn't mention was how hard it would be to live between two worlds, the reservation where I grew up learning our Apache ways, and this town where I now worked as a paralegal, fighting for justice in a system that had rarely shown mercy to people like me. Iona. My younger brother Marcus jogged up behind me, his construction boots kicking up small clouds of dust. At 19, he was already broader than me but still carried that protective instinct that made him hover whenever we were in town together. You heading to pick up Nayeli? I nodded, checking my watch. My sister Nayeli was 16, bright as lightning, and currently finishing her shift at the local diner. She'd been working there after school to help save for college, a dream that burned as fierce as the desert sun in her eyes. I don't like her working so late, Marcus continued, falling into step beside me. Especially with all the college kids coming through town. Some of them look at her like what? I asked, though I already knew. The look he meant was the same one I'd been getting my whole life, a mixture of curiosity and dismissal that reduced us to stereotypes and assumptions. You know what I mean, Marcus said quietly. Remember what happened to the Yazzie girl last month? That college boy thought he could just. That's different, I interrupted, but my stomach tightened. The Yazzie incident had shaken the whole reservation community. A wealthy student had assaulted a young native woman, and despite clear evidence, the charges had been mysteriously dropped. His father, we learned later, was a major donor to the district attorney's campaign. We reached Millie's diner just as the bell above the door chimed. The place smelled of grease and coffee, with faded red vinyl booths and a checkerboard floor that had seen better decades. Nayeli was behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, counting tips with a focused concentration that reminded me of our grandmother sorting sage. Hey, you too, she smiled, but I caught the tiredness around her eyes. Long day, but Mrs. Patterson left me a $20 tip. Can you believe it? That's great, little sister, Marcus said, but his eyes were scanning the nearly empty diner. Only a few patrons remained, an elderly couple sharing pie and a young man in expensive clothes sitting alone at a corner booth. I recognized him immediately. Bradley Morrison, 22 years old, son of Mayor Robert Morrison. He was home from his second year at Stanford, driving his father's campaign Mercedes and carrying himself with a particular arrogance that came from never having to face consequences. Bradley's eyes found Nayeli, and I watched his expression shift into something predatory. He'd been drinking. I could tell from the loose way he held his shoulders and the too bright gleam in his eyes. Nayeli, I said carefully, grab your things. We're leaving. But Bradley was already standing, swaying slightly as he approached the counter. Hey there, beautiful, he slurred, his voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who'd never been told no. I've been watching you all evening. You're not like the other girls around here, are you? Nayeli's smile faltered, and she took a small step back. I'm sorry, sir, but we're closing soon. Can I get you anything else? Oh, I can think of a few things. Bradley leaned across the counter, his expensive cologne mixing unpleasantly with the smell of alcohol. Why don't you come sit with me? I could show you what it's like to be with a real man instead of these desert rats. The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus tensed beside me, his hands clenching into fists, but I placed a warning hand on his arm. Violence would only make things worse for us. It always did. Sir, Nayeli said, her voice steady despite the fear I could see creeping into her eyes. I need to finish closing. Please return to your table. Bradley's face darkened. Don't you know who I am? My father runs this town. I'm trying to be nice to you, but you're acting like some uptight. She said no, I interrupted, stepping forward. Respect that. Bradley's attention shifted to me, and I saw the moment he took in my appearance. The high cheekbones, the dark skin, the silver jewelry that marked me as clearly Native American. His lip curled in disgust. "Oh, I see," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The whole family's here. Listen, sweetheart," he directed this at Nayeli. "You don't want to end up like your sister here, do you? Working some dead-end job, living on scraps. I could give you a real future." "We're leaving," I said firmly, moving toward the counter. "Nayeli, get your purse." But Bradley wasn't finished. As Nayeli reached for her bag, he grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. "I'm talking to you, beautiful. Don't be rude." "Let go of her," Marcus growled, stepping forward. "Or what?" Bradley sneered. "You'll scalp me. Go back to your reservation and leave civilized people alone." The slur hung in the air like smoke. I felt the familiar burn of anger, but I also felt something else. A cold, calculating rage that reminded me of the desert storms that could tear through the landscape and reshape it entirely. "Let go of my sister," I said, my voice quiet but carrying all the authority I'd learned in courtrooms and law offices. "Now!" Bradley's grip tightened instead, and I saw Nayeli wince. "Make me Pocahontas." What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Marcus lunged forward, his patience finally snapping. Bradley, drunk and unsteady, stumbled backward, dragging Nayeli with him. She cried out as her arm twisted, and I heard the sickening pop of her shoulder dislocating. Bradley released her then, more out of surprise than any sense of decency. Nayeli crumpled to the floor, her face white with pain, cradling her injured arm. "You crazy Indian!" Bradley shouted, backing away. "Look what you made me do. My father will hear about this." I knelt beside Nayeli, my hands gentle as I assessed her injury. "We need to get you to the hospital," I murmured, but my eyes never left Bradley's face. "This is your fault," he continued, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. "You attacked me. I was just trying to be friendly, and you people turned violent like you always do." The elderly couple had fled during the commotion, leaving us alone with Bradley's twisted version of events. I helped Nayeli to her feet, supporting her weight as she fought back tears. "We're calling the police," I said, reaching for my phone. Bradley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Go ahead. Call them. My father plays golf with the sheriff every weekend. Who do you think they'll believe? Me or a bunch of angry Indians with a history of violence?" The worst part was, he was probably right. In a town like Copper Ridge, where the Morrison family had held power for 3 generations, justice often wore the face of wealth and influence rather than truth. As we made our way toward the door, Bradley called out one last time. "This is what happens when you people don't know your place. Maybe next time you'll think twice before disrespecting your betters." The desert wind hit us as we stepped outside, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of storms. I looked up at the stars, the same stars my ancestors had navigated by, and made a silent promise. Bradley Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. He thought he was untouchable, protected by his father's name and his family's money. But he'd forgotten something crucial about the desert. It's patient, it's vast, and it never forgets. As we drove toward the hospital, Nayeli's quiet sobs filling the truck, I felt something ancient and powerful stirring in my chest. The desert wind knows no boundaries, and neither would my pursuit of justice. The emergency room at Copper Ridge General was a study in sterile white walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, watching the clock tick toward midnight while Nayeli was being examined. Marcus paced nearby, his work boots squeaking against the linoleum floor with each agitated step. "Separated shoulder," Dr. Martinez announced as she emerged from the examination room. "We've got her in a sling, but she'll need physical therapy. The good news is there's no permanent damage." She paused, studying my face. "The bad news is that this kind of injury is consistent with someone grabbing her arm and twisting it forcefully." I nodded, having suspected as much. "We need documentation. Photos, a full report." Dr. Martinez's expression softened with understanding. You're building a case. Maybe, I said, though I was already certain. Can you be detailed in your report about the mechanism of injury? Absolutely. And Ayana. She'd known me since I was a child, back when I used to translate for my grandmother during her appointments. Be careful. The Morrison family has a long reach in this town. As if summoned by her words, Sheriff Pete Hawkins pushed through the emergency room doors. He was a big man gone soft around the middle, with a kind of mustache that belonged in a 1980s movie and the tired eyes of someone who'd been carrying water for the powerful for too long. Ms. Crowfeather, he said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man doing an unpleasant job. I understand there was an incident at Millie's diner tonight. That's right, I said, standing to face him. Bradley Morrison assaulted my sister. We'd like to file charges. Sheriff Hawkins sighed, as if this was all very inconvenient. Well now, that's not exactly how young Bradley tells it. He says your brother attacked him unprovoked, and your sister got hurt in the scuffle. That's a lie, Marcus said, stepping forward. Bradley grabbed Nayeli. He was drunk, making crude comments, and when she tried to get away. Hold on there, son, Hawkins interrupted. I've already spoken to Bradley, and he's pretty shaken up. Says he was just trying to be friendly. Maybe offer your sister a job or something better than slinging hash at Millie's. I felt the familiar knot of frustration in my stomach. Sheriff, there are security cameras in the diner. The footage will show exactly what happened. About that, Hawkins said, not meeting my eyes. Funny thing, the camera system was on the fritz tonight. Millie mentioned it was acting up all week. No footage to speak of. Course, in a town where the Morrison family had their fingers in everything, technical difficulties had a way of happening at convenient times. There were witnesses, I pressed. The elderly couple at the corner booth. The Hendersons. They didn't see much, apparently. Poor eyesight, you know. Besides, they mentioned how dark it was getting, hard to make out details. Each excuse felt like another door slamming shut, but I'd expected this. In small towns like Copper Ridge, justice often depended more on who you knew than what you could prove. Sheriff, I said, keeping my voice level, my sister has a dislocated shoulder. Dr. Martinez's report will show the injury is consistent with someone grabbing and twisting her arm. That's assault, regardless of who did it. Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. Look, Ayana, I know you're upset. But accidents happen, especially when tempers run high. Maybe if your brother hadn't gotten so aggressive. My brother was protecting his sister from a drunk who wouldn't take no for an answer. That's your version, Hawkins said. But I've got to look at this objectively. Bradley Morrison is a college student with no criminal record. Your brother, on the other hand. He let the implication hang in the air. It was true that Marcus had been arrested once at 18, for getting into a fight with a local boy who'd been harassing native kids walking home from school. The charges were eventually dropped, but the arrest remained on his record, a permanent mark that would always be used against him in moments like this. So what happens now? Yes. Well, I could charge your brother with assault, Hawkins said. Bradley was pretty roughed up, and he's got witnesses who'll say Marcus threw the first punch. What witnesses? Can't reveal that right now. Ongoing investigation and all. Hawkins adjusted his belt, a gesture that spoke of practiced authority. But here's what I'm thinking. This whole thing seems like a misunderstanding that got out of hand. Why don't we all just let sleeping dogs lie? No charges filed by anyone, everyone goes home, and we all move on with our lives. The offer was clear. Drop any complaint against Bradley Morrison, and they wouldn't manufacture charges against Marcus. It was the kind of deal that small-town corruption was built on. Silence in exchange for avoiding consequences. I looked at Marcus, seeing the defeat already creeping into his shoulders. This was exactly what he'd been expecting, the same pattern he'd seen play out his entire life. The powerful protected their own, and people like us were expected to accept whatever scraps of justice we could get. I need to think about it, I said finally. Don't think too long, Hawkins warned. Bradley's pretty upset about the whole thing. His father's pretty upset too. Mayor Morrison called me personally, Said he's disappointed that something like this happened in his town. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Push too hard, and the Morrison family would push back with interest. Jobs could be lost, permits denied, life made difficult in 100 small ways. After Hawkins left, I sat with Nayeli while Marcus went to get the truck. She was groggy from the pain medication, but her eyes were clear when she looked at me. "He's going to get away with it, isn't he?" she asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "Bradley Morrison. He hurt me, and he's going to walk away like nothing happened." Her voice was flat, resigned in a way that broke my heart. "Just like always." I squeezed her uninjured hand. "Not always. Come on, Ayanna. You know how this works. We're nobody in this town. He's the mayor's son. End of story." But as I helped her to the truck, I was already forming a different story. One that would require patience, research, and a deep understanding of the law that went beyond what Sheriff Hawkins or Mayor Morrison might expect from a nobody like me. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the county courthouse in Flagstaff. The building was older than Copper Ridge itself, built from local stone and designed to inspire respect for the law. Inside, the records department was a maze of filing cabinets and computer terminals staffed by clerks who'd been there since the dawn of time. "Property records?" asked Mrs. Chen, the head clerk, when I explained what I needed. "What kind of property?" "Anything owned by the Morrison family in or around Copper Ridge. Going back, say, 40 years. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "That's a lot of records. Any particular reason?" "Research project," I said, which was technically true. "I'm looking into the history of land development in the area." It took most of the day, but what I found was worth every hour spent squinting at microfiche and computer screens. The Morrison family's property holdings were extensive, much more extensive than I'd realized. But more importantly, there were irregularities in how some of that land had been acquired. In 1987, Mayor Morrison's father had purchased a large tract of land from the federal government. The land had originally been part of the San Carlos Apache Reservation, but had been declared surplus during the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. The sale had been conducted through a complicated series of transactions that bypassed the usual bidding process. I made copies of everything and drove back to Copper Ridge as the sun was setting. The desert landscape looked different somehow, not just beautiful but significant. This was land that had been walked by my ancestors, land that had been taken through legal technicalities rather than honest purchase. That evening, I spread the documents across my kitchen table and began to research. The Indian Reorganization Act, the subsequent surplus land sales, the legal challenges that had been mounted and dismissed over the years. It was a complex web of legislation, court decisions, and bureaucratic maneuvering that had resulted in thousands of acres of tribal land being sold to private interests for pennies on the dollar. But laws change. Court decisions get overturned. And sometimes, justice moves slowly but inexorably toward the truth. I was still reading at midnight when my phone rang. It was my grandmother, calling from the reservation. "Ayanna," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "I heard about what happened to Nayeli. The desert wind brings all news eventually. Grandmother, I don't know what to do. The sheriff won't file charges. They're protecting him because of his family name. And what does your heart tell you to do?" I looked at the documents spread before me, at the evidence of decades of legal theft dressed up as legitimate business. "It tells me to fight, but maybe not the way they expect." "Good," she said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. "Your great-grandmother used to say that the desert teaches patience. Sometimes the wind takes years to carve a canyon, but it always finishes the job." After she hung up, I sat in the silence of my small apartment, feeling the weight of history and the possibility of justice. Bradley Morrison thought he was untouchable, protected by his family's wealth and influence. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd hurt my sister. And in doing so, he'd awakened something in me that had been sleeping, the same spirit that had driven my ancestors to resist, to survive, to endure. The desert wind was patient, but it was also relentless. I picked up my pen and began to write, starting with a simple phrase. Notice of federal land rights claim. The real battle was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since that night at Millie's diner. Nayeli was healing physically, but I could see the way she flinched when men approached her too quickly, the way she'd started wearing oversized clothes to make herself invisible. Bradley Morrison had returned to Stanford, no doubt thinking the whole incident was behind him. He was wrong. I sat in my office at Brennan & Associates, the small law firm where I worked as a paralegal, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and historical research. My boss, David Brennan, was a 60-year-old public defender who'd moved to Arizona after burning out on corporate law in Phoenix. He was one of the few lawyers in the area who would take on cases that didn't promise a big payoff. "Ayanna," he said, knocking on my door frame. "Can we talk?" I looked up from the federal land claim I'd been drafting. "Of course." David closed the door behind him and sat down across from my desk. His weathered face was creased with concern. "I've been hearing things around town. About your sister, about the Morrison boy." "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggest you might be planning something that could get you in trouble." He leaned forward. "I also heard you've been requesting a lot of historical land records. Want to tell me what's going on?" I'd been wondering when this conversation would come. David was sharp, and he'd noticed my recent preoccupation with federal Indian law and land rights cases. "Bradley Morrison assaulted my sister," I said. "When we tried to file charges, Sheriff Hawkins made it clear that wouldn't be happening. So I'm exploring other options." "Other options?" I turned my computer monitor toward him, showing the land claim document I'd been working on. "Did you know that the Morrison family's main property holdings, including the land their house sits on and most of their commercial properties, were originally part of the San Carlos Apache Reservation?" David's eyes widened as he scanned the document. "How is that possible?" The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 allowed the federal government to declare reservation land surplus and sell it to private buyers. The Morrison family purchased 2,400 acres in 1987 through a series of transactions that bypassed competitive bidding. That was 50 years ago, Ayanna. Even if there were irregularities, there are statutes of limitations. "Not for federal Indian law," I interrupted. "Under the Indian Claims Commission Act and subsequent legislation, tribes have specific rights to challenge land sales that were conducted improperly, especially when those sales involved fraud or coercion." David sat back in his chair, processing the implications. "You're talking about challenging the legal ownership of half the town." "I'm talking about justice," I said. "The Morrison family has been profiting from stolen land for decades. They use that wealth to buy influence, to protect their son when he commits crimes, to keep people like my family in their place. And you think this land claim will change that?" "I think it will cost them everything," I said quietly. "Their house, their businesses, their political influence. All built on land that was never legally theirs to begin with." David was quiet for a long moment. "This is incredibly complex litigation. Even if you're right about the law, you'd need expert witnesses, historical evidence, tribal backing. It could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." "I know." I pulled out another stack of documents. "That's why I've been in contact with the Native American Legal Defense Fund. They're interested in the case. Very interested." The NALD was a national organization that specialized in exactly these kinds of complex land rights cases. They had the resources, the expertise, and the commitment to see it through. "They think we have a strong case," I continued. "Strong enough that they're willing to take it on contingency." David shook his head in amazement. "You've been busy." "I've been thorough. There's more." I handed him another document. "I've also been researching the environmental impact of the Morrison family's developments. Turns out they've been dumping construction waste in an area that's considered sacred by the Apache people. That's a federal crime under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Jesus, Iona, you're not just going after their land. You're going after their entire business empire. They should have thought of that before they raised a son who thinks he can assault women without consequences. David studied me with new eyes. You know what this means, don't you? Once you file this claim, there's no going back. The Morrison family will use every resource they have to destroy you. They'll make your life hell. They already have, I said. The difference is now I'm fighting back. That afternoon, I drove out to the reservation to meet with the tribal council. The San Carlos Apache Reservation stretched across 1.8 million acres of southeastern Arizona, a landscape of high desert, mountains, and deep canyons that had been home to my people for centuries. Council Chairman Robert Gleason was a man in his 70s who'd been fighting for Apache rights his entire adult life. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood both the legal complexities and the potential consequences. "You're sure about the documentation?" he asked when I finished. "Positive. The federal government sold land that should have remained in trust for the tribe. The Morrison family knew it, and they bought it anyway through back-channel deals. And the Legal Defense Fund is committed. They've already assigned a team. Sarah Rodriguez is going to be the lead attorney. She's won cases like this before." Chairman Gleason nodded slowly. "What about your sister? How is she handling all this?" "She's processing. She wants justice, but she's also scared. The Morrison family has a lot of power in Copper Ridge. Power built on stolen land," he said grimly. "What does your family think about you pursuing this?" "My grandmother supports it. Marcus thinks I'm crazy, but he's with me. As for the rest," I shrugged. "Some people think I should let sleeping dogs lie. Accept that this is just how things are." "And what do you think?" I looked out the window at the desert landscape, at the red rocks and endless sky that had shaped my people's worldview for generations. "I think the desert remembers everything. Every injustice, every theft, every time someone said we should just accept our place and be quiet about it. Maybe it's time to stop forgetting." Chairman Gleason smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "The council will vote on it tomorrow, but I think you can count on our support. It's about time someone held the Morrison family accountable for their actions." That evening, I returned to Copper Ridge to find Marcus waiting at my apartment. He was sitting on my front step, still in his work clothes, looking tired and worried. "Hey," I said, unlocking the door. "You look like you've had a long day." "Got fired," he said simply. I stopped my key halfway to the lock. "What?" "Morrison Construction. Apparently they don't need my services anymore." He stood up, dusting off his jeans. "Funny thing is, just yesterday my foreman was talking about how much overtime they'd need to finish the new shopping center project." I felt a cold anger settling in my chest. "They can't do that. It's retaliation." "Sure they can. I'm an at-will employee. They can fire me for any reason or no reason at all." Marcus followed me inside. "But we both know the real reason." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "This is my fault." "No," Marcus said firmly. "This is their fault. But Iona, you need to understand what you're up against. This was just the beginning. They're going to come after all of us." As if to prove his point, my phone rang. It was Nayeli. "Iona," she said, her voice tight with stress. "I need you to come pick me up from work. Something happened." "What kind of something?" "The kind where Mayor Morrison showed up at the diner and had a very public conversation with Millie about the quality of her employees." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of consequences rippling outward. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. But I think I'm about to be unemployed too." After I hung up Marcus and I sat in silence for a moment. The Morrison family's retaliation was swift and predictable, but no less devastating for being expected. "You could still walk away," Marcus said quietly. "Drop the whole thing and maybe they'll back off." "Could you?" "Yes. If someone hurt Nayeli and faced no consequences, could you just walk away?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No, I couldn't." "Then you understand why I can't either." Later that night, after I'd driven Nayeli home and confirmed that she'd indeed been let go from her job, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the final draft of the federal land claim. Tomorrow I would file it with a federal court in Phoenix. Once I did, there would be no turning back. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Drop this nonsense, or your whole family will regret it." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. Outside, the desert wind was picking up, rattling the windows of my small apartment. But I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The Morrison family thought they could intimidate me into silence, that they could use their wealth and influence to make this problem disappear. But they'd forgotten something important about the desert. It's patient, it's persistent, and it never gives up. Tomorrow, I would file the claim that would challenge everything they'd built their power on. And then we'd see who really had the upper hand in this fight. The desert remembers everything, and so do I. 6 months after filing the federal land claim, the case had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What started as a quest for justice for my sister had become a landmark battle that attracted national attention. The courtroom in Phoenix was packed with reporters, tribal representatives, and legal observers from across the country. I sat in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table, watching Sarah Rodriguez, the lead attorney from the Native American Legal Defense Fund, present our case to federal judge Patricia Steinberg. Sarah was a small woman with fierce eyes and a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning them. In court, Sarah presents irrefutable evidence that the Morrison family's 1987 land acquisitions were fraudulent, violating federal protections for tribal land under the Indian Reorganization Act. Key documents and witness testimony support the case, but it's the discovery of illegal dumping on sacred Apache burial grounds that triggers federal criminal liability. She also outlines how the Morrisons retaliated against her family to obstruct justice. Judge Steinberg signals skepticism toward the Morrison defense, which hinges on the doctrine of laches. She affirms that tribal trust protections have no expiration and promises a ruling within 30 days. Outside the courtroom, the narrator reflects on the personal toll of the fight: blacklisting, threats, and community ostracization. But national media attention and support from other Native families have transformed their legal battle into a broader symbol of indigenous justice. 3 weeks later, Judge Steinberg rules in their favor. The Morrison family must vacate the 2,400 acres and pay restitution. The ruling cites fraud, environmental crime, and intimidation. The fallout is swift. Mayor Morrison resigns, and Bradley Morrison faces federal prison time for civil rights violations and assault. The narrator visits her grandmother to share the news. The elder already knows, thanks to word of mouth through the reservation. They sit in peace, watching the land, now symbolically and legally reclaimed, and reflect on the long-standing injustice that has finally been addressed. 2 months later, the narrator watches the Morrison home being demolished. Marcus has found new work. Nayeli, now on scholarship, plans to study law. The tribal council announces plans to build a cultural center and school on the reclaimed land. The narrator is offered a position as Director of Legal Affairs to help other families fight similar cases. She resigns from her current job and begins a new chapter, one of purpose, service, and justice. In a call with Nayeli, they reflect on the desert's power to remember and to heal. As the narrator looks out over the landscape, she understands that their victory is just the beginning, a symbol that those once considered powerless can and will change the world.